just the fact that I was building my identity in these formational years of identity development under a false premise, under the premise that my body was wrong and that I should have been born a male. Now that I am disentangling myself from this entire set of beliefs, it is bringing about a new level of confusion and distress.
Hi, everybody. I caught myself an awesome one today. I'm super excited. We've been chatting with each other, so we finally made it time to have this interview. But before I move forward, as always, I will thank everybody for watching these very important interviews. I will tell you how much it means to me that you like these and push them towards people who need to see them, and giving me this platform to be able to bring people on who don't necessarily get the platform to talk. And I really believe the trans activism tries to stop people like this telling their story. So that's why I've been very lucky to create this platform with the help of all of you following me and creating and raising awareness around all this. So that being said, I have this beautiful new human being here that I met named Maia, and Maia is going to introduce themselves and then we'll move on with the interview. Hi, Maia. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Buck. It's a pleasure to be on. So I am 24 years old, and I started identifying as trans when I was 12 in 2012.
Wow.
Yeah, so
Wow.
before anybody my age knew about it. So I really saw the whole trans movement evolve from 2012 onwards. And something different about my story is that, so I was raised in a progressive American city,
Okay.
but along the line, I ended up moving to the Middle East. I moved to
Wow.
Israel, and I lived
Wow.
stealth as a man,
Wow. What
both
a story.
both within religious Palestinian Muslim communities and within Orthodox Jewish communities.
Thank you so much, first off, for joining me today. Thank you for having this conversation. I'm very fascinated to know how. So you moved to the Middle East and you're trans. Nobody knows this though, or are you just living totally stealth?
Yeah, so I mean, I basically went there for a year, study abroad, and I
Okay.
liked it so much that I decided to stay.
Okay, great.
And within the university, everybody knew me as a woman, although they were pretty confused by my appearance, simply
Right.
because that was what was said on my documents.
Okay. So your
But
documents still said female, but you lived
yes,
as male. Okay,
but
great.
outside of the university, I had this very rich double, triple life where everybody knew me as a guy, and very few people knew that I was actually female.
Wow. Fascinating. Okay, well, that makes it comfortable, I'm sure, for you, right? It was easy for you to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, it was more or less easy. However, there are, of course, complications when you are living as a guy, but you are actually female.
No kidding. So wait,
Yeah,
how old were you when you moved to Israel?
I
How
was
old?
20.
20. So from the age of 12 to 20, you lived in the States and did you transition in the States and live that way?
So not totally. When I did reveal these feelings to my parents, I will say they were not affirming.
Okay.
And they were ahead of their time in that because nobody really knew the concept of a transgender child, with the exception of a few people who were transitioning their kids and a few people who had seen like Jazz Jennings'
Right.
special on Barbara Walters.
Right.
So this idea automatically it caused for them a lot of alarm, and actually, I mean, I basically started socially transitioning in college.
Okay.
And when this was discovered, some sort of stipulations were made that I would not medicalize and that I needed to do a study abroad year in a country that doesn't support all of this stuff.
Okay.
So I picked Israel because I had gone to Israel previously on a study abroad type of trip. It was at this institute where we studied the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I went there for 11 days. I was within Israeli borders, but also in the West Bank with a girl that I was dating at the time. And the idea to sort of live as a man in Israel actually started on this trip because when my girlfriend at the time and I were in the West Bank, we were hopelessly lost with a couple like massive, massive suitcases, hopelessly lost in a city in the West Bank. And we had gone into a cafe looking for somebody to give us directions. And the owner of the cafe automatically, immediately recognized that we were tourists. because of our suitcases, and he welcomed us in. And I might have been able to pass for an Arab because of my complexion and my ability to speak Arabic. I'd been studying Arabic since I was 12, and I really fell in love with Arabic culture. So I went into this cafe, and immediately my girlfriend and I noticed something, which is that everybody around us were men, because in most Arab cities, cafes are sex segregated. So the owner welcomes us in. He starts talking to us, and I didn't know exactly how he perceived me at that time, but he gave my girlfriend a free pass because we were very obviously tourists, and he welcomed us in. He gave us free hot dogs, free coffee. Arabs are very hospitable that way. And we were in the process of talking to him, and I had told him, well, actually, I speak some Arabic. So he started speaking to me in Arabic, and he spoke about me in the masculine. And that's the moment at which something clicked in my head. And I realized, oh, while in the United States, most people would perceive somebody like me to be a masculine woman, this guy saw me as a man. So that's when the gears started turning. And when I realized that actually in this society with very, very strict sex-based roles, where they don't know what a gender nonconforming masculine, butch woman is, they would just assume that I was a guy. So that's sort of what planted the idea in my mind that I could actually live this out. So when I came back to Israel for the study abroad, while everybody in the university knew me as a woman, in the outside world, I had a male identity, and most people did not even know that I was trans, or in the case of my Palestinian friends, a lot of them didn't even know that I was Jewish.
Okay. Wow. Fascinating. And I bet so that's really interesting. So because they didn't know you were Jewish or even a woman, did they treat you differently than if they would have known that? Do you think?
Well, there's a reason that I didn't tell them that I was Jewish.
Okay.
I mean, the ones that, the ones that knew, but yeah, I mean, I didn't even think of myself as a woman at that time. I mean,
Okay.
I always wanted to transition and to medically transition. I wanted to live my life as a man because I was not acquainted with butch lesbians, and I did not know what that type of a future or trajectory would entail. So I basically did the thing that actually a lot of women in the past, and especially a lot of butch women have done in the past, which is that they live as men, and they medicalize.
That's
Sometimes
right.
they transition, because it's much easier to get respect and to get good jobs and just to live a pretty conflict-free life, at least externally. So I didn't know that I was actually following in the footsteps of a lot of women who had come before me. What's unique about my story is that I am 24 years old now, and I am living in the 21st century, and that I still did
Yeah.
this.
Wow. Profound, actually. Very profound statement.
Thank you.
Wow. So here you are living in Israel, sort of just being male, right?
Yeah.
So now you're living male and you're feeling like a man or whatever that even means, right? Is your girlfriend still around?
No, no. I in Israel I'd had a few, but
Yeah.
um yeah, so I mean, as far as sort of feeling like a male, that's now a statement that I realize to be pretty like inherently fallacious, and
Right
like
on.
it doesn't make a lot of sense. What I was
No.
doing was fitting into society within the role of a male, within masculine roles in a society where there isn't, particularly, especially within those religious communities,
Yeah.
a way for me to rationalize myself within social relationships. So that is what I was doing over there, and I had a lot of crazy adventures, and I had a great time, honestly. I mean,
Great.
it was fantastic. I really don't know how else to describe it. I had a great time. It's
Great.
only because I went through a totally different process that I realized a lot of things that allowed me to basically desist from a transgender identity that lasted half of my life.
Wow. So now you're there living. Did you do any medicalization? Did you take hormones? Did you do anything like that?
I did not, because I
Wow.
was actually illegal in Israel for several years because of the hellish nature of Israeli bureaucracy. So
Yeah.
I didn't have access to healthcare, and I couldn't medicalize. But as soon as I became an Israeli citizen, I mean, that was the first thing on my list. Because at some point I'd realized, like, people will stop taking me seriously as a 24-year-old guy because I look so young. And
Right.
so I had to make a decision of whether or not I was going to medically transition and lose a lot of people in my life and lose a lot of important relationships, or whether or not I was going to embark on this uncharted territory of desisting.
Right.
And the first sort of seeds of doubt that were planted in my mind about this trajectory of my life, of this transgender trajectory, was really when a girlfriend of mine and I were reading the book Stone Butch Blues, and I might have been about 19 years old. And for the first time, I had heard an experience that was very similar to mine, but it was not described under the trans label. It was described as a sort of subset of lesbian experience.
That's right.
And the experience that a lot of trans men talk about and that a lot of butch lesbians talk about, it's very hard to find a meaningful difference between them because a lot of trans men were butch lesbians before they transitioned.
That's right.
So it was interesting and kind of mind-blowing to hear a very, very distinct experience described not under a trans label. But additionally, what was particularly impactful about reading this book was the fact that the main character transitioned, and she lost a lot of connection with the lesbian community because people had stopped perceiving her as female, and she'd had a lot of issues at doctors' offices, similarly to what you've discussed in the past when you were having the crisis with the vaginal atrophy.
Yep.
And you needed to convince all of your doctors that you were actually female in order for them to figure out what was going on with you. And something similar happened to this character, and a lot of things clicked into place for me, and I started to realize, like, oh shit, I've actually never given myself a chance to live as a lesbian. And what if I give it up before I've even allowed myself to do that?
Congratulations. What a beautiful statement. No, I'm not kidding, because your self-realization, that's called self-realization. That's not being pushed into a space by your peers. You're starting to actually think about your own self.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm hearing from you. That's very powerful, by the way. Wherever this story goes, that particular statement is extremely powerful, and people, especially young people, need to hear that. So I thank you for being so open here today, and also having that sort of self understanding on some level.
Well, I appreciate that. And I will add that actually, because I got into it so early, there wasn't a peer influence. I did not need an ideology to come to this conclusion about myself. I certainly didn't need it pushed. And actually, the way that I encountered this idea is that, so for my 12th birthday, I got an iPad as a present. And I was really, although I wasn't really exposed to a lot of sort of pop culture because I wasn't particularly interested in it, I was the type of kid that loved to research all kinds of niche topics online. And before it was trans, I became really obsessed with the world's tallest people because I'd started getting into the Guinness Book of World Records, and the page on the world's tallest people captivated me. So I started to do a bit of research on them on the internet, and I realized that they basically had a tumor on the pituitary gland of their brain, which caused them to be super tall. And this condition is called acromegaly. So when I was about 8 or 9, this condition was fascinating to me. And I really just did not pick up on anything that was going on around me or in school because I had very niche interests. And if something was not interesting to me, I just could not force myself to pay attention to it. So the trans topic was not my first major area of interest, but these previous interests did give me a bunch of research skills. And I had become also pretty obsessed with the Ellen DeGeneres show several years later. I thought she was funny, charismatic. I really loved her style. And when I got into this idea around the age of 12, a lot of things were sort of going on in my life. I was starting to develop feelings for my female classmates, but of course I didn't know what those feelings were because I'm really not great at feelings. I'm not a feelings person. I'm an ideas person. And there would be times in class when we would take a worksheet and pass it down, and my hand would briefly brush by the hand of one of my female classmates, and my heart rate would skyrocket. I would become kind of dizzy. sweaty. I lost the ability to speak. I was not a fan of that because I love to speak and to lecture people about topics of my interest, regardless of whether or not they shared them. So I was pretty disoriented and I didn't know what was going on. I didn't have a lot of in common with kids my age because our interests were very different. So I didn't really have peers that I could talk to about what was going on, but I did hear my peer group start to talk about crushes. So I thought that crushes were those cans of orange soda.
You're awesome.
So I really didn't know what was going on, and I was kind of confused as to why my entire peer group suddenly became obsessed with this orange soda, which I had tried at some later date at a birthday party and realized that it wasn't actually that good. So I was pretty perplexed as to why my entire peer group became obsessed with it. I didn't realize that they were talking about something entirely different. And so a lot of things started to happen around that time. So there was this element of the story, and then there was the element of the story where for the first time, I had somewhat of a desire to actually fit in with my peer group in some kind of a way. Not entirely, because I was still a weirdo. I didn't really realize that I was a weirdo. I didn't, when I was 10, I carried around a tube of extracted cow DNA for an entire year. So, and I knew that nobody else did it, but I didn't conceptualize that as me being a weirdo.
Right.
So I was quite an odd kid, but I did want to sort of fit in with my peers.
Yeah.
And what I noticed, well, I sort of started to realize that I liked the way that my male classmates were dressing. I thought they were very stylish, and this was coming at a time when I sort of wanted to forge my own path and develop my own sense of style. So, and also, so I basically latched on to a male peer group that actually I didn't have a whole lot in common with. We were about as different as any two people could be, because I was very intellectually curious, and they weren't per se. But what I did enjoy about them is the fact that they were very funny and they were getting a lot of attention from the girls. So I basically made an alliance with them, and we pulled a lot of pranks on the teacher. Whenever she'd turn around to write on the whiteboard, we would make these obnoxious whale noises at each other. And then as soon as she would turn around to see who was doing it, we would just look down at our notebooks and pretend as if we were not doing anything. So I noticed that when my male classmates did this kind of behavior, they got a lot of attention from the girls. And so there was a lot of stuff going on at this point in time in my life. And I didn't know how to make sense of it. Meanwhile, I was on the internet watching episodes of The Ellen DeGeneres Show. And having grown up in a progressive American city, I had seen cross-dressing men. I'd seen people who were very obviously male, who were wearing female articles of clothing, such as dresses and skirts. And an idea at some point popped into my mind, which is, so these sex changes that they talk about men undergoing, is there a way to do this, but as a female, as a girl, and become a boy?
Wow.
So
how old were you when
12.
you started? You were still 12.
I was 12. Yes.
Really, do me a favor. Can you move your camera a little
like this?
more? There you go. I don't want to lose your awesome face. So yeah, wow, you're still you're pretty ahead of 12-year-olds at this time. You know that. You're thinking a little bit, I guess I'm looking at higher. You just have a different kind of way of thinking, as far as I'm concerned, than the rest of the 12-year-olds. You're very, very deep thinker at 12. So yeah, okay, go on. This is so fascinating. So this is still 12 years old. Wow.
Yes.
Just wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to know whether or not I could do what these men were doing and live as women, because the FTM stories had not received popular coverage at that time.
Yeah.
And just like any question that would have popped into my mind, whether it regarded these really niche brain tumors or any other topic of my interest, I had a question and I looked it up. And I had seen a lot of sort of pop psychology articles, maybe not a lot, a few that I read over and over and over again. A couple documentaries, a couple programs like Jazz Jennings on Barbara Walters' show. Yeah. But also I'd seen a few medical journals, and I was the type of kid that liked to read that stuff.
Okay, great.
So that's sort of how I got introduced to the idea, and I immediately clicked with it. It seemed to explain a lot. I mean, it explained the distress that I was feeling, which before I had realized that I had crushes on girls, I was feeling all of these physical symptoms of what you would consider to be a crush, you know, the skyrocketing heart rate, the sweating, the confusion. And because I was a researcher and I was interested in medical topics, I looked up all of these symptoms. And if you look up any kind of normal symptoms on WebMD will tell you that you have some kind of cancer and that you're going to die. So I was looking for an answer, and all of these things started to cause me a lot of distress. I mean, I felt a lot of distress around my body, which a lot of girls would feel during puberty, and I was feeling a lot of distress and confusion about these feelings that I just did not know. I did not know that this was the orange soda that all of my friends were talking about. I had no clue. So this idea was extremely enticing to me because it provided a framework and a way in which I could understand myself and also a way out of the distress. So I latched onto this idea, and despite the fact that I was not affirmed by anybody, the idea stuck around. And it gave me a framework through which I could grow up and essentially just become a straight guy for all intents and purposes, and live a life where I could have a girlfriend, I could have a wife, and nobody would think twice about it. And so basically, from the moment that I started to develop my sense of self and my identity, it was based on a false premise. So even though I didn't medically transition, although I got quite close, and that was the desire the entire time, to sort of remedy the gender dysphoria, just the fact that I was building my identity in these formational years of identity development under a false premise, under the premise that my body was wrong and that I should have been born a male. Now that I am disentangling myself from this entire set of beliefs, it is bringing about a new level of confusion and distress. Wow. Because while somebody, if they didn't encounter a trans identity at a young age and didn't stake their entire future and their sense of self on it, they might have to grapple with reality a little bit more, the discomfort they have around their body and things of that nature. I never grappled with any of that stuff because every little bit of distress I'd basically put it in a metaphorical box in an attic with a bunch of cobwebs, and I just didn't touch it. I never had to overcome the distress that I had around my breasts because I thought, well, someday I'll just remove them. Yeah. And I never had to come to an understanding of how do you live in the world as a very gender nonconforming woman. And we're not just talking about a little bit tomboyish, somebody who's a little bit tomboyish that grows out of it and becomes heterosexual and gets married and has kids. We're talking about something that is very different from that is much, much, much more socially alienating. So I, at this point in my life, am having to contend with all of this distress and all of these feelings and questions that I should have been dealing with and coping with as they came up in my life. And instead I put them on the back burner and staked everything on transition. And now that I realize that transition is, as far as a treatment of gender dysphoria, I mean, it is, I guess, one of them, although there's no real evidence base for it. And also the treatments are extremely risky, extremely risky. Like even if you emerge from a transition and you don't assimilate that experience as something that you regret, it's still very medically dangerous. And when I started to realize that this plan that I had staked my entire life on could put me at actually grave danger, and I knew that I wanted to live in the Middle East and that, you know, a place that's very prone to war, and I didn't know whether I would be able to access those medical treatments, I really had to start thinking much more seriously about it.
So were you like 20 when you moved to Israel? And
yes,
that's when you started reevaluating this whole thing?
No,
at that age?
No. So I lived about 4 years as a man in Israel. Okay. And actually what caused me to start seriously questioning this trajectory in my life was, so the desistance process for me actually started in a bomb shelter. Oh, wow. In May of 2021. That was my first war in Israel. It lasted 11 days. We were having rockets launched at us from Gaza, launched by the terrorist group Hamas. Oh. And it was my first war in Israel. I was alone. I was petrified. It is the most existentially terrifying experience that anybody could go through. Sure. And I was in and out of bomb shelters. You know, you hear a siren and you have a short amount of time to get to a bomb shelter.
Yeah.
And when you're in these bomb shelters, I've learned that these bomb shelters are just particularly depressing places to be because for somebody in my generation, they don't have Wi-Fi. And so I had no way of distracting myself from what was going on. So I just heard these rockets. And if I didn't make it there in time, I would hide under a tree and I would see the rockets one after the other going above my head. You can hear them ripping through the air. It's terrifying. So I was in a bomb shelter and I was hearing all these noises and I was hearing the sound of these rockets being intercepted by the Iron Dome and hearing the explosions. And in between sirens, I would go back to the apartment and I went on Instagram and I was starting to see that my American friends were posting all kinds of things about this conflict. And the things that they were posting were extremely troubling to me. They were basically justifying the fact that Israelis had to live under rocket fire. They were very pro-Palestine, but not in the way that I was pro-Palestinian, because first and foremost, most of these people had never met a Palestinian that actually lived in the country where this war was going on. Yeah. And secondly, they were basically justifying the actions of this terrorist group that not only, in addition to terrorizing Israelis and making Israelis' lives hell by shooting rockets at us in their genocidal attempt to eliminate the Jewish state, but a lot of these rockets actually fell short in Gaza. And they hit Palestinians in Gaza and kill them. And Hamas can take those numbers and add those to the list of casualties. And it's something like about a quarter of the rockets fall short in Gaza. But and what these Americans didn't understand is that even if you don't give a crap about the Jews, which I'm convinced that a lot of them don't, even if they claim that they're not anti-Semites, right, the fact that Hamas is putting Palestinians' lives in jeopardy and is, even when they aren't shooting rockets at Israel, they're making their own civilian population, they're putting them in danger actively and are policing them with an iron fist because of their religious, super religious jihadist ideology. And at that point, I had realized, okay, these Americans don't know what they're talking about, but it's because they haven't had the experience that I've had. And my pro-Palestinian position was based on the fact that I actually have Palestinian friends. Like I was talking about earlier, I was very well integrated within Palestinian Muslim communities, and I even have Palestinian friends who live in Gaza who I'd met abroad. So while these Americans were cheering for the Palestinian side to win, as if wars are some kind of a soccer or football match that you can just root for one side, I was rooting for this entire thing to stop because I didn't want my Palestinian friends or my Israeli friends or their friends and family to die. I wanted it to be over. But these people were not coming from that place. They were coming from a place of ideological virtue signaling. Yeah. But essentially what I had thought at that time was, okay, well, these people just need to be exposed to the other side of this, to the side that nobody else is going to expose them to. And I was young and naive, and I basically thought, well, if I present them with verifiable, credible media and statistics to show a more well-rounded and comprehensive version of the picture, they will include that within their logical calculus. And I trusted my argumentation skills because I was a debate kid and I had some kind of basic understanding of how to construct an effective argument with ethos, pathos, and logos. So I went online and I was looking for all kinds of statistics to underscore the fact that these people don't actually know what they're talking about and that Hamas is a terrorist group. And while my arguments did not convince anybody, and in fact, it just made them hate me a lot more. And, you know, these people who were tweeting and Instagram posting from their comfortable couches in California, while I was living in the most terrifying time of my life. So they didn't buy my arguments, of course.
Yeah, argument, it's literally lived experience that they love to say lived experience.
Yes.
You're actually in the bomb shelter.
Like, yes.
Oh, gosh. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, go on.
Yes. So, and it's not just lived experience because there are all kinds of statistics to back it up.
Sure,
and the fact
of course.
That Hamas literally hijacks international aid to build tunnels for its weapons instead of, you know, and to use its civilian population as human shields instead of like using those
Unbelievable.
tunnels to protect innocent
That's right.
people from these wars. They deliberately
right.
put their
Well,
own civilian
they
population.
throw the Palestinians under the bus every single day.
Yes,
Every
and
day.
yes, and they benefit from
That's
these
right.
high levels of deaths because they
That's
know that
right.
Westerners care about life
That's
when
right.
they themselves teach their children to become martyrs and to engage in terror attacks and suicide bombings
It's
from the
mind-blowing.
youngest of ages. So
Totally.
basically, I realized that the Western left didn't know what they were talking about. So
Yeah.
that's one part of this story. But the other part of the
Yeah.
story is that we know that algorithms on the internet are incredibly, incredibly powerful.
That's right.
So the more research I did to try to prove my point to these Americans who
Yeah.
wouldn't learn anything anyways, I was, because it was around 2021, there were these culture wars starting in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And transgender ideology was one of the points of contention culturally. So the more research I was doing, the more I got into the rabbit hole of the culture wars on the more right-wing side of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
And I had seen a lot of these like reactions to woke TikToks. And that didn't de-radicalize me immediately because I was not super entrenched within the trans community because I didn't want people to know that I was trans. I wanted to live a life as a normal guy. And I was very well integrated within religious communities. So, and like when the non-binary thing had started to happen, I also didn't relate to it at all. I didn't relate to the aesthetic of the colored hair and the piercings. It didn't really entice me. I wanted normalcy, and I wanted the ability to, as you say, like assimilate into the broader society and not impose upon people. So in that sense, I was the truest transsexual that one could be. But what ended up happening is that, so the more I'd gone down the rabbit hole, I'd started to see the stories of detransitioners pop up.
Yeah.
And I did not relate to their stories at all because they were swept up in the social contagion, the peer influence.
Yeah.
And my story was very different because I'd gotten into it so early and I actually didn't want being trans to be a part of my identity. I wanted to move on from it. And so because I didn't relate to that modern narrative, I didn't assimilate the more negative aspects of the trans community into my sort of trans identity. So that was not hard for me to divest from. But what was hard for me to divest from, especially sort of, so when I started to see these detransition stories, because I didn't relate to these stories because they were mostly feminine and heterosexual young women. And I immediately thought, I mean, why would any of you transition? Even when I'd seen this happening in real life, these very feminine straight girls transitioning, I just thought, why would you do this? This seems like a bad idea. Because it was very different from my perspective, and my perspective was echoed in those sort of early clinical reports of the typical cohort of female gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
And because their stories were so different, I thought, well, I'm not going to regret it. And I considered myself to be the truest of the true transsexuals. I had related to a lot of what you were saying. But then you were also talking in some of your videos about the medical complications. That planted the first seed of doubt in my mind that it's very possible that I could do these medical interventions and not regret it, but it could risk my life. Yeah. And maybe there are better ways to handle the distress. Maybe there are ways of handling gender dysphoria outside of a medical transition. But also I had gotten to the point where I was able to start meeting detransitioners in real life, including some butch lesbians. And that's the moment in which I realized that actually there are women whose stories are incredibly similar to mine, and they transitioned and they still regretted it. Yeah. And that's the moment in which I realized, well, the best case scenario here is that I transition, I pass as a man, I assimilate into society as a man, but I have medical complications that I may not be able to predict, and that I may not have adequate access to healthcare depending on where I am in the world in order to be able to like have my life saved at the last moment if need be. So that's a best case scenario. And that I don't regret the aesthetic changes or the social role, but that I end up with medical complications. Yeah. And in the worst case scenario, I could have massive medical complications and experience a lot of regret because I will have never allowed myself to just live as a lesbian. And that's the moment at which I basically made a conscious decision where I'm going to draw a line in the sand and say, no matter how much I love living as a guy, and no matter how much distress I have around my body and around my sexual orientation. And I mean, no matter how much I've wanted to do this medical transition, and no matter how big of a part in my identity this has been for the last literal half of my life,
Yeah.
I'm going to draw a line in the sand and basically say, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to invest in my future. Because even though I'm almost 25, I know that my brain is nowhere near being fully developed, especially because I have a diagnosis of ADHD, which we also know slows the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for all kinds of executive function, large parts of our personality, our ability to foresee the consequences of our actions. So that's sort of the reason that I made the decision that I made. And a lot of people will say, well, you weren't really trans. You should have never been doing this, and you should have never had this proposed to you as an option. But the truth is that by all metrics of gender dysphoria, even if we take it outside of these online discourses where people say you don't need dysphoria to be trans, I would also posit that actually just because you have dysphoria, it doesn't mean that you need to transition.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Bam. That is like so excellent that you just said that, because it is such a great other side of what they keep saying. You don't need dysphoria, but you literally say what I keep saying. Just because you have dysphoria doesn't also mean you're trans. It can mean something else. So, wow, the things you're saying are so amazing, friend. And I really appreciate you being on the show. And I really appreciate you putting your voice into the arena, because this is what we need to hear from young people. We need to hear this from you. You literally live from 12 to 20, 21, 22, whatever, 24 to 24.
Yes.
Okay. If anyone has the sort of experience or understanding, it's you, not these young people who just decided they were trans yesterday. And I hate when they say that you weren't really trans. How dare they say that to you? Because I really believe that on some level you are, on some level, but you are making the choice, like some trans people do, not to take that route. That's what you're doing. You're choosing something else because you see a different way of being. You might change your mind down the road. You might, who knows? It doesn't matter. But at this point in time right now, you're choosing, no, this is not the right space for me. How can we not on some level just say to you, we care about you, and if that's what's going to make you a better person, we should all be behind you. If every trans person should be behind you and say, God bless you, that if this is the thing you need to do, we should be supporting you. Why are they not supporting people like you?
Well, I think that we sort of know why, which is that, I mean, especially I think that my case is much more threatening to them, because
You said
my
it right
story is actually not very different from your story, but we've taken different life paths.
That's right.
And I do wonder if a lot of these older lesbians who've transitioned,
Yes.
if they had realized
Yes.
that there are medical complications associated with this path,
Yeah.
and if they had realized that there are therapists who will actually help them deal with their distress. And I'm not just talking about pushback, because pushback is important, but pushback is not going to get somebody to take a healthier or more fitting path. It is actual like therapy that helps people understand themselves for what they are, instead of to construct their entire identity around something that they are not and will never become.
This should be the last resort, by the way. And I'm 32 years. I'm solid. I am a transsexual. I'm very happy with my space. But as a 30-year-old person, I did this after living many lives as a gay woman, as a kid. You know what I mean? All of these things. That being said, back in the day, all the lesbians hated me because I transitioned, and they were like, what? They freaked out. Then this is the weirdest part, Maya. Move forward 10, 15 years later, those same lesbians came to me and said, I want to transition now. I'm like, what? How is that even possible? You would have felt it 15 years ago. And now all of a sudden you are. So what you're saying is so great, because I believe some of these butch lesbians are on some level feeling they need to transition for some weird reason. Why didn't they want to transition 15 years ago?
Well, I think I have an answer for that. And I don't think it's for some weird reason that it appears 15 years later.
Great.
I think that there's actually not a super meaningful difference between like your classic butch lesbian and your quote unquote true transsexual.
Okay.
I think that A, a transsexual is somebody who has a lot in common with somebody like me. The only difference is the medical piece. I
That's
don't
right.
think that it's actually a meaningful difference in identity. I don't
Right.
think that there's something that at its core separates a true transsexual from a very gender nonconforming homosexual.
Right.
And transition is one of the possible coping tools for gender dysphoria.
Yep.
Now, the jury is still out as to whether or not it is the most effective one, or whether or not it is the most efficient way to cope with the distress, right?
That's right.
There's no evidence base
Yep.
for it. So some
Nope.
people do it and they don't regret it, and they can, they can come to be like, they can become happy with
That's right.
the changes that they've made, even if it does cause them medical harm.
Yep.
But with these lesbians that you're talking about, we know that butch lesbians are essentially the original cohort of female gender dysphoria. If you go back into the old sort of clinical writings about gender dysphoria in females, they describe all of the same things that we're hearing from a lot of FTMs.
That's right.
And I believe that I was vulnerable to this ideology before it even became an ideology as such, when it was just an idea in its infancy of an ideology. I didn't need peer influence. I didn't need every institution within Western society pushing it. Even though I got a ton of pushback, a ton of pushback, I hung on to this idea. And I think there's something important to understand about that, because butches are uniquely vulnerable to falling into the idea that they need to transition in order to live happy, fulfilling lives.
True.
Precisely because of the fact, and I can speak from my own experience, when I was living as a man, I was not like these other girls who are feminine and heterosexual, where they basically had to make an entirely new male identity that was very different, where they had to actively sever parts of themselves. Yeah. I didn't have to do that. I modified my name slightly. I went by a male name. I wore a binder, but other than that, I didn't have to talk in a different way. I didn't have to act in a different way in order to fit in with the guys. Just the way that I naturally am and go about in the world made it so it actually wasn't a stretch at all. And I had a very seamless life living as a guy. And I think a lot of the butch lesbians that you're talking about, they've experienced something very similar, where they get a lot of flack for being gender nonconforming women. They have to put up with a lot of stuff. That's and right. Frankly, at some point, they can't take it anymore.
That's right.
And butches have been transitioning for at least a few decades, forever. Medically, in quite large numbers for the last several decades.
Yep.
So I don't think it's weird. I think it's actually it's actually a very rational decision to make when you don't realize that there are medical consequences and you can't foresee the fact, especially when your peer group is doing it.
Yeah.
When a lot of butches are rationalizing their experience as being the experience of a man in a woman's body. So just the way that you shift your mindset around it automatically means, well, if I'm a man in a woman's body, then I need to make my outside match my inside.
That's right.
So I think it actually makes perfect sense why you notice this shift in your peer group, and that's especially why we need to have more gender nonconforming gay people, including butch lesbians, speak out about this, because we are a uniquely vulnerable group.
That's right.
And our stories are really not being told within mainstream media.
They never have been, friend. Remember how old I'm, 61. I lived as a butch lesbian for many, and I agree with you 100%. It is not easy to walk the world as a butch woman. It is. I don't care if you're gay or straight. My sister's super butch, straight lady, right? She's a cop and like a cowboy and all kinds of stuff, right? Everyone's like, oh, she must be a les. No, she's actually not. She's just a very masculine woman. But I know that masculine women have a heart, so as feminine men do. These ideas, these stereotypes is what we really need to be talking about. And that being said, yes, I see what you're saying in that regards. They think it's going to be easier. On some level, I know that I kind of make it look simple. I understand my position that I'm in this day and age, but that's why I speak out about it. I made the decision at 30 years old, right? I didn't make the choice at 12 or whatever. I lived a whole life before this. It's all my responsibility at this point. Nobody else's responsibility. So that's why I don't care if somebody 30 decides to make this choice. I care about somebody your age. To me, you are still a young person. You are still got a lot of life ahead of you. And to make these are irreversible. I don't understand this conversation that it's not It's not irreversible. What are we talking about? That is so, not even that, your brain. So your brain, so is your brain, how do you, I guess my question to you is, how are you dealing with all of this situation? Because it's heavy. What you're saying is very heavy.
Yeah, I would definitely say it's quite heavy. I think
Yeah.
that so a lot of the stories that you hear about detransitioners, they are
Yeah.
stories of medical harm, and I'm very
Yeah.
grateful that I haven't sustained medical harm,
Yeah.
because I see how close I got to it. And I will say that people act as if social transition is just a way to test things out, but that is untrue. Social transition is an extremely, extremely powerful psychosocial intervention. Those are not my words. Those are the words of Hilary Cass,
Right. Right.
who's commissioned a review of the systematic evidence and
That's right.
around these treatments. And we're not just talking about children. 18 isn't some magical age in which you suddenly
That's right.
became, in which you suddenly become like super capable and super able to understand yourself.
It's
Um,
I like 17 and then 18 you
right.
magically become so, I know it's so absurd.
It's totally absurd. And even when I was 18, I knew that I wasn't fully psychologically developed. Even at 24, I know that I'm not fully psychologically developed, although I'm a hell of a lot closer to it than I was at 18. But this idea that we should just socially transition kids and young adults and sort of provide that as a first step for treating gender dysphoria, from my own
Yeah.
personal experience, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Social transition is the first step if you are hell bent on medically transitioning.
Yeah.
And if you want to, if you think that that is your only way out of gender dysphoria, and by the way, I still experience gender dysphoria. I mean, it is very hard to psychologically divest from a sense of self that you started building when you're 12 and it has persisted for half of your life.
Yeah.
That's difficult. So,
Yeah.
and because I'm not, some emotional expert or even super good at identifying and understanding my own emotions,
Yeah.
what I will say is that the more I've been in contact with fellow butches, I've realized, including some who have transitioned, some who have transitioned and detransitioned, and some who have just transitioned and are still transitioned, but they recognize that at their core they are butch lesbians. What I've learned from them is that the trajectory of my life is actually extremely, extremely typical for women who will grow up to be masculine lesbians.
Wow.
And and that includes sort of the way that our brains work.
Sure.
I, in many ways, have a much more male typical brain, even compared to other lesbians, and especially compared to the women I've dated in the past. And so it's very easy for butches to think that they have a male brain or a male soul in a
Yeah.
female body, because
Yeah.
in many ways our brains are much more male typical in the way that we
Sure.
experience attraction to women. Not just the fact that we experience it, but the way in which we experience it, the sort of highly visual nature of it. Even without testosterone, a lot of butches can have a much more male typical brain.
Yeah.
And so the more I've been talking to these women, the more I've realized that my trajectory is actually extremely, extremely common, and that I'm not as much of a weirdo as I thought I was. I'm a weirdo in my own merit, in my own way.
You're not a weirdo. You're actually super awesomely intelligent. Like, you are not a weirdo. You're super focused. You're smart as hell. You are, if you're not somebody now, you're gonna be somebody. I can already tell. No, I'm not kidding. I'm not like blowing smoke up your ass. I'm literally, I can hear you. I can listen to you, and you're so strong, and you could argue this in such a great, we need you. That's what I think I really want to say. We need you. As you know, I'm a trans guy. I will be that for the rest of my life. But at the same time, I do not believe this is a space that just anybody should be taking on. I believe this is rare. I believe it's a very committed space that you have to take on. I believe you have to live some life before you even make this irreversible space. So I think by you and I having these conversations, we can build a bridge to hopefully show butches that they don't have to take this route. And we need to talk about societal norms and societal stereotypes, and this idea that if you're a butchy girl, all of a sudden you're trans. You see what they're doing now? Now they're literally going straight to trans with these kids.
Mm-hmm.
It's scary. It's actually scaring me.
It is really scaring me. And that, what you said, reminded me about something else that I'm seeing in the sort of gender cradle space,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is that, there are a lot of parents who they see their daughter transform once they've been exposed to this idea, they become sort of socially withdrawn. They'll
Yeah.
start wearing these big black hoodies, cut their hair really short. And there have been a lot of parents who talk about how they've gotten their children to desist from a transgender identity and to re-identify with their biological sex.
Right.
And there's something about the discourse within this niche space within the gender critical community, which is that there are a lot of parents who discuss, for example, how their children are being socially transitioned under their noses. And they'll say, the school is using male pronouns and a male name for my child. They got my daughter a binder. She's wearing male's clothes. She's using men's shower products. And I want us to be extremely careful with lumping all of this stuff into the same level of like maladaptive and psychologically harmful. Because
Excellent.
referring to your child in an opposite sex name and identity and giving them a binder, those are all harmful. They are not neutral. They are harmful physical and psychosocial interventions. But if you lump that in with your child's trans identification and you lump that with a gender nonconforming appearance,
yeah,
that I think is a very dangerous route to go down.
Yeah.
Because in some of these cases, these kids will just grow up to be heterosexual, and even of their visible gender nonconformity, they'll grow out of it as part of their sort of sexual awakening. Yep. That's something that we see a lot in a lot of stories that I'll see in your comments section, where a lot of women will say, if I were born today or 10 years ago, I would have transitioned. But that's not the cohort I'm talking about. Right. We're not talking about people who are slightly tomboyish and grow up to be straight. In my case, at least. So I think that we need to be very careful in lumping this together, because if you as a parent see the name, the pronoun, and the binder as same level of dangerous and same level of thing that needs pushback as simply a masculine or gender nonconforming appearance, you don't know exactly how much harm you might be doing to your child when you rail against that, the sort of aesthetic appearance. Because if your kid ends up growing up to be straight, and they might be somewhat gender nonconforming, they might be very gender nonconforming, they might be very, very female typical, you don't know. But what we know about teenagers is that if you rail against something that they're really passionate about, they're going to dig their heels in and they're going to rebel against you. That's right. So if you have this classic ROGD type of kid who is getting into this because they're very highly open, creative, maybe autistic or have ADHD traits or something of that nature, those kids also are naturally going to be pretty gender nonconforming, especially if they're not super great at picking up on social cues. And I know that that is definitely part of my story. But whether your kid grows up to be straight or gay, if you lump in the clothing and the masculine haircuts and the male shower products into the same level of panic as you do around name, pronouns, and binder, you don't know how much harm you could be doing your kid. If your kid ends up being straight, it will just strain the relationship. If you don't let them dress the way they want to and have the kinds of haircuts they want to. And in the case of a kid who's going to grow up to be gay, like in my case, you railing against their gender nonconforming appearance can actually be harming them in such a way that it re-entrenches the internalized homophobia and pushes them further and further and further into their trans identity, because they really do truly think that it is unacceptable for them to be very masculine in a female body or very feminine in a male body. And especially when they're experiencing same-sex attraction, they will, because of black and white thinking and because of the innocence and naivete of youth, they will think that that literally makes them a member of the opposite gender or the opposite sex that needs to fix their body with experimental medical treatments. So that is also a point that I don't hear discussed very often, that I would like to have discussed as well.
That's actually a great point. You're making such a brilliant point, because that's the same thing going back to social transitioning. And also, how dare these schools? How dare they do that behind a parent's back? I'm a parent, and I would freak, and I'm trans, and they were doing that shit to my kid. Oh my God. And also, how do you think that helps our community? It doesn't. It makes us look like we're indoctrinating kids. And you got to let kids just be. They will figure it out. We all did. We all figured it out. But for you to start, you make such brilliant points here, because you're right. If you're saying like you can't be butch as a girl, well, then that means I'm a boy, right? You're literally giving these kids mixed messages. And again, I'm always going to go back to stereotypes. God, people, like, so what if your kid is like a butch little girl? So what? That's awesome. And you should be celebrating that. Instead, we're giving these kids these messages that they're wrong, that they're the wrong body, that they can change their sex, which is a complete total lie. You cannot change your sex. I knew that at 30, but I might not have known that at 10. My parents, thank God, just let me be. Just let me be, find my place. They were always, I knew I was a girl. Sometimes I got to be with the boy name. Sometimes they didn't give me mixed messages. They said, you are a girl. They never called me a boy. They never, you know what I mean? They just played the little game with the fun nickname, right? But other than that, they never made me ever question whether I was a girl. I knew exactly I was a girl. So, but on that point, you just made a very powerful statement there. And that parents need to hear that. Just let the kid alone. Stop playing also into this fantasy of trans. Trans is a fantasy that's been put into these kids. And you're right, so many young girls, right? Maya, so many young who've never shown any masculinity are all of a sudden trans guys. And they're not even presenting masculine. They're still sort of presenting kind of feminine. I can be trans if I want to be. It's all so dangerous. It's all so scary to me. And it all, how do you think it makes me feel, Maya? This worked out for me. And I feel very happy with my transition. I feel very much that I created a space for myself in the world to become Buck and to live a beautiful life and have a family and have kids. And everything I've ever wanted is at my fingertips. But then I turn around and I see people like you and all these people struggling in this space where I'm like, oh my God, these shouldn't ever be put in this space. We have to bring back Butch, if that makes sense. We
Absolutely.
have to celebrate it and be okay with it and stop pushing people into these boxes. It's crazy. I wish I could talk to you for 5 hours. I can't because it's just the way it is. But I want you to just wrap it up here for a minute, and then I'm going to bring you back on because I'm pretty sure everybody's going to want to talk to you. And
It would be my honor.
leave something here that you really want to leave the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I would say that, a lot of people have asked me, what would you have wanted your younger self to know? First of all, I would have wished that my younger self never got into this at all in the first place.
Right.
Because even though I didn't medicalize and I don't have the consequences of medical harm,
Sure.
I have a lot of stunted psychological development that I'm going to need to make up for when I'm now going into my mid-20s. But what I would say is that I want my story to serve as inspiration because young butches, when I was looking into this detrans content, I didn't see a single story that in any way felt relatable to me. Yeah. And because I didn't see any stories that felt relatable to me, I was still married to the idea of transitioning for another at least couple years. Wow. Because I thought I'm the true transsexual and everybody else is a faker. Right. And what I want to say is that I want my story to serve as an example for other young women and men in my position, the very gender nonconforming ones, the ones that easily can sort of convincingly pass as a member of the opposite sex, depending on what social situation, like in my case, being in the Middle East, it was very easy without medicalizing. But I want other people to see my story, other young butch women. And even though our stories aren't out there in the media, because it's much easier to sort of sell the story of a very feminine young woman who has been masculinized by testosterone, and that is obviously a tragedy. That is undoubtedly a tragedy. But it is equally a tragedy when young gays and lesbians who are uniquely vulnerable to this ideology get swept up into it through gay organizations. When they go in for help and psychological assistance with sort of homophobia, internalized and external, this trans idea these days gets pushed on them, even in Israel. Wow. And I want the world to know that our stories need to be heard because we are the original cohort of people that were transitioned in mass. And I want other young people in my situation to see positive comments on this video. And I want this video to be shared like crazy so that young women who are considering desisting or who are considering a trans identity in the first place to be able to see this and to see positive comments, to see that type of affirmation and love bombing that they're seeking within the trans community and to realize that that is temporary and this is real. and that they can come out if they so wish to and share their stories, so that everybody starts to realize that actually all of this stuff has been done within the framework of gay rights. The trans movement is using the same arguments as the gay rights movement was, and they're doing this, and it is harming gay people. It is harming young gays and lesbians who don't have any experience being in loving relationships, being in a loving community, and living a healthy adult life. And so the thing I would just wish that everybody would know is that, you know, if you think that part of your kid's gender dysphoria is related to a developing identity as a homosexual, developing same-sex attraction, I would really urge you to be very careful around the types of organizations that your child affiliates with. Because even if you think my child isn't vulnerable to trans, simply the fact that they are gay makes them extremely vulnerable. And you should be very wary of any of these gay youth organizations. I would argue that these days, in the West at least, they're all ideologically captured. They're even ideologically captured in Israel, in the Middle East. So I would be very wary of that. And I would find gays and lesbians, gay and lesbian adults who share your belief systems and see the harm that is being done. And if you can include older gays and lesbians in your child's life, who can show them a positive role model and give them an example of what they can aspire to, that would be the biggest benefit that you could give your child. So, and not just gays and lesbians, people from different backgrounds, because we know that these types of really bad, unevidenced ideas that become radical, they really thrive in super enclosed, ideologically similar backgrounds. So if you can even have friends, adult friends in your life who are interesting people and who come from different cultures, they speak different languages, they come from different societies. I'm not just saying put your kid in a gay bubble with older adults. No, I'm saying include older gays and lesbians in your child's life, and also include people from a variety of different backgrounds who maybe share very similar intellectual interests with your kids in addition, so that they can see, especially if you are, if you have a kid who's a bit of a weirdo like I was and still arguably am, they need to see what their future looks like. That's the biggest asset you could give to your kid.
Brilliant. That was just so powerful. And it's this, I just want to thank you again, Maia, because you're a very powerful person. You have a place in this world. You have a purpose. I know it. There's just, you're going to save so many people from going down the wrong path. And it's just, it hurts my feelings to watch these young kids. And also the homophobia is rampant through the trans community. It's disgusting. Many of us early on came from the gay rights space as well. I'll always be a part of the gay community because it was the place I started, and I feel very connected. If it wasn't for gay men, I wouldn't have this great transition. They helped me sort of navigate the world on some level. So with that, Maia, thank you so much. I got to run because I have a whole another, it's like crazy. I don't even want to interview with me, but it's because of people like you putting this amazing word out there, and let's help people. Let's get the people who really need this medication, and let's get the people who don't need it, but can just sort of flourish in their space and understand you don't have to take this route. This should be the last resort for anybody out there. Seriously, I'm not kidding. I'm so happy you didn't take the medical route. Oh my God. God was looking out for you, just so you know.
In the Holy Land.
Seriously, friend. So with that, everybody, please leave lots of beautiful comments. Maia is an amazing human. I'll have her back on the show. And remember, like, subscribe, do all those things. I'll see you on Wednesday on the live. And thanks for joining us today.